put us on a big case.
Which one?
The Alcatraz Escape from June 11th, 1962. is still an unsolved case to this day.
That vaguely rings a bell. Think it made a lot of noise back then. What do we have on it?
3 inmates with a history of bank robberies who pull off the impossible. They escaped from Alcatraz, the most secure prison in the United States at the time.
Well, that's something.
Among the trio of fugitives, we have 2 brothers, John and Clarence Anglin, and Frank Lee Morris. Their plan was well thought out, and they followed it to the letter. Reconnaissance, preparations, then the execution. They escaped through a hole they'd previously dug in their cell wall and made their way to the prison roof. They headed toward the north shore of the island, then prepared a makeshift raft across the water separating them from the mainland. And then, nothing. The investigators lost their trail once they entered the water. To this day, we still don't know if they succeeded in their escape. However, we do have some pieces of evidence that might help us shed some light on this damn mystery.
I see you've got the case files with you.
Yeah, we've got plenty to go through with this. Al Capone, Mickey Cohen, Bumpy Johnson, Whitey Bulger, Machine Gun Kelly. Alcatraz prison certainly brought together the most dangerous criminals in the country. I suggest we first take a look at the history of this penitentiary. It'll help us get a clearer picture of this escape, considered one of the most complex and successful ever carried out in the United States. You know the saying, power isn't given, it's taken. And that's exactly what you'll be doing in World of Tanks, the sponsor of today's video. For a limited time, the legendary Peaky Blinders are taking over the battlefield. From March 20th to March 31st, the Shelby family's stepping into the war zone with a special Battle Pass event. You'll fight alongside Tommy Shelby, Arthur, John, Ada, and Michael Gray, each fully voiced and bringing that iconic Peaky swagger. And of course, what's power without rewards? By playing the event, you can unlock exclusive Peaky Blinders themed content, like the Tier 9 Premium French Medium Tank, the Charmarat, inspired by World War I era combat vehicles, custom Peaky Blinders decals and inscriptions to bring that Shelby touch to your fleet, and even a specially composed soundtrack straight from the world of Peaky Blinders. And if you're new to World of Tanks, now's the perfect time to jump in. It's a free-to-play game on PC, and by using my link in the description or pinned comment, you'll get 500 gold, the T2 Light Tank, Tier 6 USA, 200,000 credits, 7 days of premium access, and 3 exclusive Peaky Blinders decals. So, click the link in the description to claim your rewards and join the fight before the event ends on March 31st. And remember, this isn't just a game of war, it's a game of power. Alcatraz. Clearly, a prison like no other. They say the island began to house prisoners in the late 1860s, after the Civil War. Originally, it was a military prison where most unruly soldiers and political enemies were sent. It wasn't until 1912 that the central structure of the island appeared, that large concrete block we know, which would serve as the prison, built by the military prisoners themselves. It contained 600 cells. At the time, it was simply the largest reinforced concrete structure in the world, which made Alcatraz Island very famous. Some even gave it a nickname, The Rock. The status of the prison changed in 1934. No more military prison. Alcatraz became a federal penitentiary for civilian inmates. The idea was to send the most dangerous individuals in the country there, those who were the most incorrigible and had a high propensity for escape. So, you'd find bank robbers, kidnappers, murderers, and even organized crime bosses. Their goal was to create a prison from which escape would be impossible, where corruption and favoritism wouldn't exist. A prison where the conditions would be extremely strict, where inmates wouldn't be addressed by their names, but by a simple number, a very draconian concept imagined by the Attorney General of the time. who recalls.
Shortly after I became Attorney General, I conceived the idea of an institution for the most unmanageable of our federal prisoners. I first discussed the matter with President Roosevelt, and after obtaining his approval, I made an extensive search for a site. San Francisco Bay was finally decided upon. I selected the warden and the guards, and followed closely each step in the making of the new prison. In the federal prison system, Alcatraz represents the ultimate in isolation. These men are hourly conscious of the hum of life about them. Life is so near, but liberty so far. As I made my way about the island, the conviction grew with me that here surely was a prison from which no man could escape. We were ready.
The worst of the worst prisoners were transferred to Alcatraz starting in 1934. Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, Bumpy Johnson, Whitey Bulger, and Mickey Cohen, to name just a few. Big names who probably contributed to the island's mysterious and almost mythical atmosphere. But at Alcatraz, these individuals were nothing, reduced to mere numbers, meant to break them mentally. Their conditions of detention were particularly unbearable. Privileges were reduced to the bare minimum, with only basic needs such as food, water, clothing, and medical care. No access to newspapers or radio, only limited access to the library was allowed. Receiving or sending mail was considered a privilege. The right to work was not given to everyone. At Alcatraz, you had to earn it. But the worst was probably the rule of silence. A rule imposed during the early years of the federal penitentiary that prohibited prisoners from speaking to one another. It was abolished at the end of the 1930s due to the cases of insanity it had caused. William Henry Ambrose, a Chicago gangster who arrived at Alcatraz in the early 1930s, remembers it very well.
Capone is burning up at restrictions, but he's not losing his mind and cracking up. He's been in the hole 3 or 4 times for talking. The no-talk rule's the hardest thing in Alcatraz life. For him, for every prisoner there. Not a word can be spoken by any of the convicts in line, at the table, at work, or in their cells. It's the toughest pen I've ever seen. The hopelessness if it gets to you. Capone feels it. Everybody does. The inability to speak must have been hard to bear. That prison director was ruthless.
James Aloysius Johnston. He was the first director of Alcatraz when it became a federal prison. He wanted to make this prison a model of maximum security in every way. He figured that if the penitentiary was designed to house the worst of the criminals, he needed to select the best guards to watch them. He hired enough to ensure maximum surveillance. This meant Alcatraz had 1 guard for every 3 inmates. Obviously, this was far from the 1 guard for 12 to 30 inmates ratio in other facilities across the country. The prison guards at Alcatraz had to closely monitor each inmate and conduct frequent head counts.
Frequent? How often?
12 head counts a day.
Holy crap!
They really wanted to show the public that they were determined to curb the rise in crime during the 1930s. In 30 years, crime had increased by 1,000%. The idea was to make Alcatraz a place that would deter other criminals from wanting to stay on the rock. For those already incarcerated there, the damage was already done. Yet that didn't stop some of them from thinking about escape. Charlie Berta, considered one of the toughest inmates at Alcatraz in the 1930s, said,
"Alcatraz was a place without hope, a prison of the mind. The only thing that kept me going was the thought that I could someday get out. A lot of these guys had gone through a lot of suffering. They had nothing left. But no matter what kind of time a guy's doing, it's a counting game. One's counting off the time he's lost, and the other's counting down the time until the end."
Another testimony, this time from inmate Jim Quillen, number AZ586.
Hell, these men had nothing to look forward to. It was how they existed. They were in misery with the idea of no future, you know? Their young life was now spent, no turning going back in time to make things right. I even found myself in that desperate state of mind, knowing I was never going to get that back. Trust me, some of these guys were very, very serious about getting out, one way or another. Prison life was tough enough, but Alcatraz amplified the grimness. San Francisco was right there in front of you. The sights, the sounds, even the smells were taunting. You could sense the movement happening right across the water. I can't explain it, but you could see it all right there. You'd hear women laughing on boats as they passed the island. You could hear them. That sure made things tough for a lot of men. They're pulling these long sentences. They're left with the reality of their situation. They lived with only their memories. Some had enough. They made a decision that they were not going to live out their final days rotting away on that island. I don't think people really understand what it's like to live in that environment for years on end. Most anybody can survive weeks or months living in that state. But think of the mental strain that comes from living that for a continuum of years. We were told when we could eat, when we could sleep, when we could smoke, when we could read, when we could shit. Alcatraz was harshest in those terms. One way or another, some of these guys were going to taste freedom again. On their own terms. They were going to taste freedom at least one last time. Dead or alive. They figure they're dead anyway.
Escape. That's what gave hope to these prisoners. For many, it was a recurrent topic of discussion. Stories and legends of past escapes constantly circulated on the island.
Wait a minute. Are you telling me that the 1962 escape wasn't the first?
Well, according to the records, there have been 14 escape attempts since the prison became a federal penitentiary. Escape attempts actually started back when it was a military prison, with more than 35 attempts. Military and federal prisoners faced the same challenges. The most notable being the sea that surrounded the island, a real obstacle for the fugitives, who had to contend with the strong tides. So, of the 35 attempts from the military era, 17 prisoners drowned.
And what about the 14 attempts between 1934 and 1962?
That's what we're going to look at now. Thanks to the records, we'll be able to learn more about each one. These are key details that might help us solve the 1962 case. It's not impossible that the Anglin brothers and Frank Morris were inspired by their predecessors. So, what do we have? Here's the first escape attempt. An attempt made on April 27, 1936, by inmate Joseph Bowers, number AZ-210. Bowers arrived at Alcatraz in September 1934 with a 25-year sentence for a botched burglary. He was part of the first groups of prisoners to arrive on the Rock. The prison's chief doctor tells us more about his case in a report shortly after his arrival.
Bowers was a man of extremely low mentality, upon which is superimposed of an extremely ugly disposition. He's a custodial problem and will probably have to be dealt with by firm measures.
Another report from the doctor suggests that Bowers suffered from mental illness. He was also considered insane and desperate by the other inmates. The rule of silence, imposed during the early years, along with the relentless routine of the prison, weighed heavily on him. One day, he refused to work in the laundry where he was assigned. The result? He was confined to a cell measuring 1.8 meters by 1.8 meters for 3 months. One day in June 1935, while he was supposed to go work in the laundry, he started shouting, "Put me in the dungeon! I do not want to go to work!" He was then severely punished, placed in isolation, and put on a restricted diet. Later, he was sent to work at the island's incinerator, located on the western side of the Rock. A mundane but grueling job. Bowers seemed to cope with this new job until that fateful day, April 27, 1936. On that day, against all odds, Joe Bowers tried to escape. Ervil Chandless, a prison guard, remembers the scene well.
While on duty in the Toad Tower at about 11 a.m., I suddenly looked to see inmate Joseph Bowers on top of the wire fence attempting to go over. I then yelled at him several times to get down, but he ignored my warning and continued. I fired 2 shots low and waited a few seconds to see the results. He started down the law side of the fence, and I fired 1 more shot, aiming at his legs. Bowers was hanging on the fence with his hands, but his feet were pointing down toward the cement ledge. After my third shot, I called the armory and reported the matter. When I returned from calling the armory, the body dropped into the bay.
The fall from the cliff proved fatal for Bowers. But for some, like Roy Gardner, Bowers didn't try to escape that day. Also a witness to the scene, he recalls.
It was reported that Bowers attempted to escape, but that wasn't the true story. I saw the second shot fired, the shot which dropped him from the fence, dead, to the rocks 50 feet below. Joe was sent to work at the incinerator, alone. He was working there when a garbage truck dumped some papers, and the wind blew some of them over the fence. Bowers was under orders to keep the place clean, and attempted to climb over the fence to gather up the papers. The guard in the tower overlooking the incinerator ordered Bowers to get down off the fence. Bowers protested that he had to gather up the papers, and the guard shot him twice. The truth of the matter was that Bowers made no attempt to escape.
A similar opinion was shared by another witness, Mr. Archer, a young guard officer.
About 10:50 a.m. this date, I heard 2 shots fired. Running to the door, I saw prisoner Joseph Bowers standing on the ledge outside the fence by the incinerator. Mr. Chandler was standing outside the road tower on the edge of the platform nearest the incinerator, rifle in hand. As I watched, Bowers started climbing the fence, apparently trying to get back inside the yard. He succeeded in getting an arm and one leg over the topmost strands of barbed wire when a third shot sounded. His body stiffened and hung there for a few seconds when he fell backwards out of my sight. So did he simply want to do his job, or was he crazy enough to attempt the impossible?
We'll probably never know. In any case, it was the first escape attempt from Alcatraz, and it sent a clear message to the prisoners. The guards wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone trying to breach the prison fences. The Anglin brothers and Frank Morris were warned. The second escape attempt occurred on December 16, 1937. Theodore Cole, known as Ted, and Ralph Rowe are the protagonists of this escape. There were 2 bank robbers transferred to Alcatraz at the same time. The 2 already knew each other, having met in a penitentiary before arriving at Alcatraz. Ted and Ralph both had a strong tendency to escape, and on the Rock, they were considered the worst of the worst. Ted Cole's file describes him as a stupid, vicious killer with an unusual calm. His file's filled with acts of violence and crimes punishable by the death penalty. It's said that Ted was a vicious criminal who committed robberies, kidnappings, and other crimes that crossed state borders. As for Ralph, he wasn't an angel either. His file's packed with mentions of bank robberies spanning over a decade. Like Ted, he was transferred to Alcatraz because of his numerous escape attempts. On the Rock, he was a constant threat.
This prisoner's a constant noisemaker, promotes discord among the other prisoners by attempting to keep them from going to work, and by use of the foulest of profane language directed at the officers. To solitary A block because he was constantly agitating inmates in D block, and also challenging guards to come in and fight.
Ted Cole and Ralph Rowe were reunited again, this time in the country's most secure prison, a prison where they didn't plan to stay long, as the idea of a potential escape quickly took root. It was in the old industrial buildings of the prison, located at the far north of the island, that they would find the flaw. Ted and Ralph were assigned to a tire repair workshop located in a building that had escaped the security renovations. The bars on the windows were made of soft iron, left by the military in the past. Ted and Ralph decided to exploit this flaw. For several weeks, or even months, they capitalized on this gap, quietly and alternately sawing the bars of a window at the back of the building. On the day of the escape, the weather was particularly foggy, which would become their biggest advantage. Ted and Ralph immediately seized the opportunity. It all began during the routine 1 p.m. head count. Ted and Ralph were present with the other inmates in the workshop. When the next head count arrived, at 1:30 p.m., the guard checked once more to ensure everyone was present, and surprise, no sign of Ted or Ralph. Alvin Karpus was present that day. He remembers.
Ralph and Ted pop out of the window from the floor beneath us, in work clothes and bare feet. Ralph Rowe tries to wrestle the padlock off the fence, but he's all nerves. Ted Cole takes the wrench from him and calmly twists the lock open. The two make their way to the water's edge. Access is difficult because rubber tires circle the shores of the rock. Ralph and Ted move cautiously past the barbed wire, but as they reach open water, they're picked up by the current and taken off rapidly in the direction of the Golden Gate Bridge. I then whispered to my fellow prisoners. They're gone.
Did they really leave? I mean, did they really pull it off?
Well, just minutes after the 1:30 p.m. head count, the alarm was raised. The prison authorities immediately began searching for them, but nothing. No trace of Ted Cole and Ralph Rowe. The deputy warden of the prison wrote in a report.
We made a complete search of the area without finding any additional clues or signs of the men. No footprints, no clothing. We combed the island thoroughly, entered all residences covering every inch of the island. U.S. Coast Guard boats were also notified of the escape, and the entire surrounding waters of the island were thoroughly patrolled. There was also an exceptionally strong current running in the vicinity of the island at that time, caused by an exceedingly high tide.
Drowned, then?
That's what the authorities will think. An opinion shared by the deputy municipal engineer of San Francisco, who said in the local newspaper,
"The day Roll and Cole made their getaway was one of the exceptionally high tides. A strong swimmer starting at Alcatraz would have found himself going out the Golden Gate in the fog before he had expended sufficient energy to reach shore in still water. Small boats could not have bucked the current."
Like the 1962 case, investigators lose their trail once they enter the water. Despite extensive searches on the island and along the coasts, nothing conclusive. One might wonder if the duo managed to survive after all. The theory of success then began to emerge. Some newspapers published articles saying the two men had apparently been seen in bars, or that they had committed robberies after their escape. A former Alcatraz inmate would later tell an investigator that he was certain they had succeeded. The hope of a possible success started to spread among the island's prison population. Alvin Karpus wasn't as optimistic, though. He remembers.
As we had stood at the window watching, Ralph and Ted picked up speed. They had just passed the buoy straining on its side from the strong current when, less than 500 yards from shore, Ralph disappeared as if someone grabbed him from under the water.
A very strange case.
You said it. The case is still unsolved to this day. Prison authorities concluded the case by sticking with the drowning theory. But some elements suggest otherwise. Yes, because we also have two hitchhikers who claim to have seen the fugitives, and sometime after the escape, they positively identified them as Cole and Rowe to the police, using photographs. As for the robberies committed after the escape, most of the victims also identified Ralph Rowe and Ted Cole as the culprits. But the most intriguing element is undoubtedly this article from April 1941, a few years after the mysterious disappearance.
They're now living in South America, have resided for periods in both Peru and Chile. The only prisoners ever to stage a successful break on the Rock. They have eluded all the law enforcement agencies engaged in one of the nation's greatest manhunts. Rowe and Cole made good their escape with two large airtight oil cans. The oil cans were securely strapped together. They floated lightly on the swirling waters. All Rowe and Cole had to do was hold on to the straps on the cans. They contacted the automobile of a Confederate on a Marin County road, but they drove away alone. The notorious fugitives are reported to have plenty of money today, to be living comfortably in their South American hideouts.
Ultimately, no matter the outcome of this story, Ted and Ralph's escape gave new hope to the prisoners of Alcatraz. Escaping the Rock was apparently possible. The escape of Ted and Ralph revived hope among the prison population. It became the most discussed topic among the inmates, who were already starting to devise their own escape strategies. Meanwhile, the prison authorities tried to reassure the public following the unrest caused by the incident. The idea was to implement improvements aimed at reducing the risk of escape, particularly in the old industrial building from which Ted and Ralph had escaped. This building was old and not fully secured, and the fact that it was located at the far end of the island, near the sea, still posed a serious escape risk. Since security improvements had been delayed, other inmates also had time to attempt their chances. One such attempt was made by James Lucas, Rufus Franklin, and Thomas Limerick, all of whom were serving lengthy sentences for bank robberies. This happened on May 23, 1938, and would become one of the most violent escape attempts. On that day, Lucas, Franklin, and Limerick were working in the carpentry workshop of the building, and they decided to take advantage of the element of surprise to regain their freedom. They carefully observed the guards' routines and noticed that one guard was stationed on the top floor of the building where they were working, and two others were on the roof. The escape attempt began when Franklin killed the guard on their floor with a hammer. With the guard dead, the way was now clear to access the roof. The three prisoners made their way up, hoping to neutralize the two remaining guards. However, as soon as they reached the roof, things went south. Limerick was immediately shot and killed. Franklin was wounded by gunfire, and Lucas managed to hide. The attempt failed miserably. Lucas and Franklin were later captured by officers, and both were sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of the guard.
You really had to be desperate to try something like that.
January 13, 1939. That's the date of Alcatraz's fourth escape attempt.
Who are the protagonists this time?
Arthur Doc Barker, Dale Stamphill, William Martin, Henry Young, and Rufus McCain. Bank robbers, as usual.
It seems Alcatraz was full of this kind of criminal.
These guys made up almost half of the prison's population. Bank robbers were, in fact, the ones most likely to attempt escapes. They were responsible for the most spectacular and complex heists of their time. They were intelligent, meticulous, determined, and used to planning elaborate schemes to get what they wanted. At Alcatraz, they continued doing what they did best and began studying every corner of the prison, looking for any weak spot they could exploit to their advantage.
I understand now.
So, let's get back to this fourth escape attempt. It seems that Doc Barker was the leader of this escape group. Doc Barker had apparently thought about escaping ever since his arrival on the Rock. Henry Young, one of the participants in the escape, described him as a determined person.
Barker was one of the most dangerous men in America. I knew he was determined and ruthless, and that once he started on anything, nothing could stop him but death. If I were to escape from Alcatraz, it would undoubtedly be with him.
Barker worked in the same repair shop as Ted Cole and Ralph Rowe. He even helped them during their escape attempt by providing them with the necessary tools to saw through the bars of the windows. He knew his turn would come one day, so he thought long and hard and decided that the best way to escape would be to exploit one of the prison's weaknesses, just like Ted and Ralph had done before. Luckily, there was a weak spot in the section of the prison where he was incarcerated, Block D, a structure that still dated back to the military era. Block D housed the most dangerous inmates, those who refused to follow the rules and were considered problematic. Confined there, Doc Barker saw a weakness he could exploit. The bars on the cells hadn't been updated since the original structure of the prison was created in 1912. Since the bars were made of soft iron, it was easy to saw through them with simple tools. Barker figured this was the vulnerability he needed to exploit. Of course, he couldn't do this alone. That's why he recruited Dale Stamphill, a prisoner serving a life sentence for armed robbery and kidnapping. He was the one who provided the contraband tools to saw the bars. Henry Young, Rufus McCain, and William Martin later joined the group. And it was on the night of January 13, 1939, that the inmates decided to put their plan into action. Thanks to the sawing done previously and the makeshift sealant used to cover it, they managed to escape their cells by slipping through the bars. The group then made their way outside. They scaled the high prison walls and headed toward the beach. The night was foggy, making it difficult for the guards to spot them. Barker and his accomplices tried to find materials on the beach to build a makeshift raft, when, suddenly, the prison alarm went off. A guard from Block D had noticed the sawn bars. The escapees rushed to finish making the raft, but it was already too late. The guards had already started searching the island for them. That's when a guard, posted in a watchtower, spotted them. He ordered them to surrender, but the prisoners ignored him. The guard then opened fire. They were all captured. The outcome was one dead, Doc Barker in this case. He died sometime later in the hospital due to his injuries. His last words were, "I'm crazy as hell. I should have never tried it."
It's quite a few weaknesses for a prison that's supposed to be the most secure in the country.
The prison authorities were well aware of the problem. They knew they had to improve the security of certain buildings, specifically the old industrial building, where most of the escape attempts had occurred until then. They had to act, and they did, by abandoning the old building in favor of a new one constructed in 1941, a building that was safer and more secure, especially for the guards. Then there was the renovation of Block D, with a change made to the bars on the cells, which were now made from a more solid material.
But I guess that wasn't enough, since the escape attempts didn't stop there.
Exactly. The next one came on April 14th, 1943. James Borman, Harold Brest, Floyd Hamilton, and Fred Hunter, all four incarcerated at Alcatraz for bank robberies and kidnapping. And you won't believe it, but once again, the escape attempt came from the old industrial building.
Again? But I thought it had been abandoned.
Well, not entirely. The lower level of the building was still being used as workshops for the inmates. Borman, Brest, Hamilton, and Hunter worked down there, and they took advantage of the situation to make their escape. It started with the hostage taking of two guards. The first guard was quickly overpowered by the prisoners. According to the guard, the individual seemed particularly determined, ready to do whatever it took to escape the island, even if it meant killing someone.
Keep quiet! Look, you can't win. You haven't a chance for a clean break. Use your heads, men.
Once the first guard was subdued and tied up, the four inmates turned their attention to the second guard. The latter quickly sensed that something suspicious was going on. The workshop was quieter than usual. He entered to inspect the area, but as he tried to leave to raise the alarm, the prisoners attacked. The guard fought back fiercely and refused to go down without a struggle, but he too was eventually overpowered and tied up. The group of escapees wasted no time. They fled through one of the building's windows, scaled the prison fence, and, once on the beach, plunged into the water. Borman, Brest, and Hamilton began swimming away from the island, heading slowly towards San Francisco. Hunter, injured after falling from the fence, retreated to a small cave to take cover. Suddenly, the alarm sounded. A guard stationed in a control tower spotted several figures in the water attempted to swim away from the island. He fired his Springfield rifle and managed to hit one of them. Borman, struck in the head. His body sank into the depths and was never recovered. Brest, who had been swimming alongside him, was apprehended by the authorities. The same went for Hunter, who was picked up by a penitentiary boat. As for Hamilton, he was presumed drowned. The authorities searched for him for a long time but never found him. In reality, Hamilton had turned back when he heard bullets whizzing over his head. He made his way to the cave where Hunter had hidden. Hamilton stayed there for 2 days before giving up and returning to a workshop in the old industrial building. In a twist of irony, it was one of the guards he had taken hostage just days earlier who found him curled up, weakened by hunger.
Poor Hamilton, so close to the goal.
Another attempt. This one was carried out by John Giles, inmate number AZ-250, sentenced to life for murder. Giles worked at the loading dock, a place where army laundry was unloaded to be cleaned. Taking advantage of his situation, he stole a full army uniform, which he planned to use to try to leave the island incognito. The attempt took place on July 31st, 1945. Giles, dressed in his uniform, calmly boarded a launch carrying several soldiers. At that moment, Giles thought he was heading to San Francisco, but that wasn't the case. The boat was actually heading to Angel Island, an island not far from Alcatraz. With the alert of his disappearance already given, a boat managed to catch up with the launch carrying the prisoner. He was apprehended and sent back to his cell. Here's another one, and this time, it's serious. The attempt took place in early May 1946. Its name, the Battle of Alcatraz.
Battle of Alcatraz? This story's starting to get serious. What do we have on this?
Well, this is the most violent and bloody escape attempt ever seen on the Rock. The escape plan was devised by Bernard Coy, a bank robber from Kentucky, known for his multiple escape attempts. On the island, Coy worked in the main cell block of the prison, which gave him a certain amount of freedom of movement. One day, he discovered a flaw in the armory that overlooked the cell block. He realized that the bars protecting the armory could be widened with a prying tool. So, Coy's plan was to sneak into the armory, steal weapons, take the guards hostage, and finally, escape from the prison. To carry out this plan, he was joined by 5 other individuals: Joseph Kretzer, Marvin Hubbard, Sam Shockley, Miron Thompson, and Clarence Carnes. All were convicted of stealing something at some point in their lives. It all started on May 2nd, 1946, when Bernard Coy and Marvin Hubbard attacked a guard in the main block. They managed to overpower him, then freed Joseph Kretzer and Clarence Carnes from their cells. Coy then went to the armory. He widened the bars using a tool provided by his accomplices and sneaked inside. Keep in mind that Coy had deprived himself of food for quite some time to be able to pass through these bars. Now he's in the armory. He waits for the guard to return, then overpowers him. Once that's done, he distributes weapons to his accomplices. The group then heads towards Block D, where they free a dozen prisoners, including Sam Shockley and Miron Thompson, who complete the team. At this point, their goal is to find the key that will allow them to access the prison yard and reach the island's dock, where they can escape aboard a prison boat. They search for the key but can't find it. In fact, it's one of the guards they've been taking hostage who has it. The prisoners search everywhere except the right place. After long minutes of searching, they finally get their hands on it. They try to open the door, but unlucky, the lock jams. The thing is, before finding the right key, the prisoners had tried several others, which caused the security mechanism to jam.
Trapped then.
Yeah, trapped, but still not ready to give up their weapons. They were too determined to stop anytime soon. Coy and his accomplices decided they would fight until the end. What followed was a gun battle between the prisoners and the guards of the main cell block. A battle that lasted 2 days and required the help of the US Navy to neutralize the rebels, especially to rescue the guards still being held hostage. Shells, grenades, it was war at Alcatraz. In the final hours, having nowhere left to hide from the relentless gunfire, Kretzer, Coy, and Hubbard took refuge in the service corridor of Block C. They were the last to keep fighting, as Shockley, Thompson, and Carnes decided to return to their cells. That day, only death could have stopped them, Carnes recalls.
When they decided to die, I was there. It was on the bottom steps of C Block, and they were talking about it like ordinary conversation. That struck me. I didn't know what I expected, but I didn't expect them to casually talk about dying. Coy said, "Well, they're not going to get me." Hubbard then said, "Well, they're not going to get me either." Kretzer then said, "Well, we better save some bullets for ourselves."
In total, 2 guards taken hostage died in the Battle of Alcatraz. 14 others were injured. Shockley and Thompson were sentenced to death and executed in San Quentin's gas chamber. As for Clarence Carnes, he was sentenced to life imprisonment again. Carnes would play a significant role in the 1962 escape. I think it's time we talk about that. So, 3 prisoners disappear on the night of June 11, 1962. John and Clarence Anglin and Frank Morse. Let's start with the Anglin brothers. These 2 brothers came from a family of 14 children, with John being 1 year older than Clarence. They also have an older brother, Alfred. Together they form a close-knit trio, sharing a certain adventurous spirit. Originally from Georgia, the Anglins later moved to Florida. John and Clarence Anglin came from a modest farming family. Life was not always easy, but the Anglin brothers stayed united, even in difficult times. The brothers helped their parents by working in the fields, and once their workday was done, they loved swimming in the nearby lake. It was one of their favorite places. They loved swimming and were particularly agile in the water. John even won a swimming competition in his youth, crossing a 650-meter lake in record time. Sometimes they would even swim in temperatures below freezing, challenging each other to see who could last the longest in the icy water.
Wait, were these guys trained beforehand, or is it just me?
What's certain is that they were comfortable in the water. Otherwise, school became increasingly difficult for the 2 brothers, despite their good grades. As newcomers to the area, they were constantly harassed by their classmates. One of their sisters told us more about this.
They hated school because they were always getting teased because of their clothes. None of us had nice clothes, and the boys were especially ashamed. My mother often had to patch their trousers in the worn spots, and it got to the point where they were too embarrassed to be seen in them. They were just teenagers and got fed up with being cackled at every day. I think they just decided that enough was enough. They started skipping school and would swim all day, and then only come home at night. They started stealing and getting into trouble about that time. It was really difficult for them, being constantly tormented by the other kids at that age. They really loved them boys and gave them the best of what they could, but it just wasn't enough.
John and Clarence began skipping school, and little by little, they ventured into a life of delinquency, particularly learning the art of theft and burglary. From there, the Anglin brothers slipped further into a life of crime, until they committed a robbery that would change their fate forever. It was a bank robbery in 1958, in the town of Columbia, Alabama. John, Clarence, and Alfred decided to carry out a major heist to make as much money as possible to start over. They attacked the bank and walked away with a nice sum for the time, over $18,000. They fled, and from then on, it was a manhunt for the 3 brothers. They did their best to stay under the radar of the authorities, but were eventually caught sometime later in Ohio. Alfred, John, and Clarence were tried, fully assuming responsibility for their crimes and pleading guilty to all charges. The result? They were each sentenced to 35 years in prison and sent to the Atlanta penitentiary. There, they were separated due to their tendency to escape. Alfred Anglin, who stayed in Atlanta, informed their mother about this separation in a letter.
Dear Mom, just a few lines to say hello. Hope these few lines find everyone at home well. As for us, we're okay. Mom, I wanted to write you and let you know that brothers John and Clarence are being transferred to different places. Brother Clarence is going to Leavenworth, Kansas, and Brother John is going to Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. They leave today.
In Lewisburg, John wasted no time in coming up with an escape plan, which was thwarted after prison officers discovered the plot. It was then transferred to a more secure facility at Leavenworth, where his brother Clarence was incarcerated. The 2 brothers were reunited after 2 years of separation. It's reported that they attempted to escape multiple times there. Given their long sentences and the high risk of escape, John and Clarence Anglin were then sent to Alcatraz. John first in October 1960, followed by his younger brother 3 months later. On the Rock, John could rely on the valuable advice from a former inmate with whom he befriended, James Whitey Bulger, a former bank robber serving a 20-year sentence for a series of armed robberies. He had earned his ticket to Alcatraz following a failed escape from the Atlanta penitentiary. Thanks to Whitey, John learned the essential rules for surviving on the island before his brother arrived. And when Clarence arrived, he wrote this letter to their mother.
I thought I should write you and let you know that I've been transferred here in Alcatraz. I've seen John and he's all right. I'm making out here okay. It's sure not as cold as it was there either, and I haven't been assigned any work yet, but there's nothing to worry about. I'll get along all right out here.
At that time, Clarence's cell was located near another inmate, who will be just as important to us as the two brothers.
Frank Lee Morris. What do we have on him?
Born in Washington on September 1st, 1926, Frank didn't have an easy childhood. His past is quite blurry and hard to trace. Frank claims to have never known his parents. According to records, his mother was a drug addict, always struggling with issues. Not much is known about his father. All we know is that his stepfather frequently abused her. According to Frank, his parents died when he was 11. He says he was raised in various foster homes, which he constantly ran away from. He spent a significant part of his youth in juvenile detention centers. Like the Anglin brothers, he started with small thefts, and then, step by step, escalated to larger crimes, such as bank robberies. Frank Morris is described as a calm, solitary man who has difficulty trusting others. He never really appreciated the friendship of anyone. In short, a guy who mostly keeps to himself and rarely engages in conversation. Apparently, he also has an IQ of 133, which is above average, an intelligence he would use to escape countless times from the prisons where he was incarcerated. Whitey Bulger knew Frank very well.
I knew Frankie Morris at Atlanta. He had several escapes in his past. Freedom was so important that he risked his life each time, and each time he got better at it. I read some of the documents written in his youth. Kind of shakes me up reading the things he wrote at such a young age. He had a hard life.
So, I guess all these escapes earned him his ticket to Alcatraz.
Indeed. January 18th, 1960 is the date Frank arrived on the Rock, almost a year before the Anglin brothers. Whitey Bulger recalls.
I never considered Morris or the brothers as dangerous people. Frankie and the Anglins were all exceptional guys. They never hurt anyone, but paid a hefty price with years of slow time in prison. Looking back, I remember Frank sizing everyone up and not saying or revealing much. He was always suspicious of others around him. I expect he must have been burnt by so many of those he trusted in his younger years. In regard to the brothers, they were a credit to their families, clean living and adventurous. That's how I remember them. They were quiet and fixated on one thing: to leave Alcatraz. Alan West was a different story altogether.
Alan what? Who's that?
Alan Clayton West. Less known than the other three, yet he played an important role in the 1962 escape plan. At Alcatraz, West had a reputation as the arrogant guy, always at the center of racial conflicts within the prison. One of the guards on the island, who testified in 1994, remembers him very well.
What was he like? I didn't like him. I thought he was a piece of shit. What you might not believe is that I liked most of the guys there. I remember West smirk whenever I'd say hello. Most all the men were actually very pleasant to be around, but West was the kind that carried a grudge against the uniform. I remember West.
Alan West arrived on the Rock in April 1954, long before the others. He also got involved in delinquency at a very young age. His criminal career quickly followed. Burglaries and thefts were the most common offenses on his record. In every prison where Alan West passed through, he was a threat to the authorities. He was considered a dangerous inmate, frequently involved in racial riot attempts. In short, a vicious man, capable of aggression, even without prior provocation.
One question's bothering me now. How did all these people get to know each other? Because I can't imagine how West could have gotten along with Morris and the Anglin brothers.
Well, it turns out they already knew each other. The four men had already met at the Atlanta penitentiary and the Rayford prison in Florida.
I see. And when did the escape plan begin?
That's what we're going to explore right now. The preparation for the escape started shortly after Frank Morris arrived at Alcatraz. Frank had been assigned to the prison library, where he helped organize the books. Alongside him was a certain Clarence Carnes.
Clarence Carnes? So we're back to him.
At the time Frank Morris arrived on the Rock, Carnes was indeed the head librarian. Whitey Bulger tells us more about this meeting.
When Frank first arrived on Alcatraz, he worked in the prison library and lived in C Block on the second tier right below me for a short period in the library. He became friends with Joe Carnes, who'd been on Alcatraz since 1945. Joe knew the layout and workings of the prison better than anyone. Joe was more than willing to help a fellow convict to beat the system. Joe knew all of the guards and their personalities. He knew who was most alert and who was lazy.
It was thanks to Carnes that they would obtain valuable information about the prison. Carnes actually had a good reason to do this, according to him.
One of the reasons I continued to help him, aside from just being a good convict and helping my friends, was that I knew someone would set foot in San Francisco, and I knew that place was going to close.
Interesting. And what about the Anglin brothers and Alan West and all this?
The two brothers hadn't yet arrived at Alcatraz by this time. Alan West, however, was already there. Thomas Kent, another inmate who worked with Frank Morris and Carnes in the library, recalls.
We all heard it together from him. In February of 1960, we were working in the library. Frank Morris, myself, and Joe Carnes. Outside the library, Alan West, carrying a paint can, who was painting the cells, came over to the library screen and called us over. In a whispered voice, he says, "I just found a way out. I just found an escape route on top of B Block. I think it could be made. There's a vent up there that I think could be opened. We could get out through the back of the cells and put dummies in the beds some night."
So, the escape plan was born during this period.
Yeah, the idea of escaping started to take shape from then on. During the early years of the federal prison, there were indeed rumors saying that the ventilation shafts mounted on the roof offered a potential escape route.
Another flaw in the prison to exploit then.
Yeah, that's right. And it was only later that the Anglin brothers would join the plot. It's said that they became involved in the conspiracy starting in March 1961. Lloyd Miller, a correctional officer, had indeed alerted the assistant warden about something suspicious going on between Clarence Carnes, the Anglin brothers, and June Stevens.
Who's that again?
Another inmate who worked with the Anglin brothers in the kitchen. He was a trusted friend of Clarence Anglin. On the evening of March 9th, 1961, Officer Lloyd Miller noticed something suspicious.
During the latter part of the evening meal tonight, I noticed Carnes talking to Stevens in what appeared to be a very serious and confidential conversation. As I moved to try and overhear it, Stevens broke it off and moved to the rear of the steam table. Carnes was seated eating, and Stevens, a dining room orderly, was going through the motions of clearing the empty table near Carnes. After the dining room was cleared and the remainder of the culinary detail turned into the dining room, I noticed that Stevens met the two Anglin brothers as they entered and took them over to one side. There, he became engrossed in a serious and confidential conversation with them where no officers or other inmates could overhear. This conversation lasted several minutes. I have no idea what it was all about, but it certainly was no usual inmate conversation. They were always on the alert and watching us very closely.
So, if I understand correctly, it's Carnes, through Stevens, who would have informed them.
We're not entirely sure. What's certain is that Miller's testimony proved that the Anglin brothers were involved in the plot by that time, thus joining the group of conspirators. July 1961. This is where things get interesting. The Anglin brothers and Alan West managed to settle in neighboring cells located in Block B. John was in B150, West in B152, and Clarence in B154. 2 months later, Frank Morris joined them by settling in B138, just 5 cells away from John. It was at that point that the escape planning started. 3 times a day during meals, Alan West, Frank Morris, and the Anglin brothers gathered in the prison cafeteria to discuss the project. These periods were crucial for them to develop their plan. It roughly gave them an hour each day to debate the method they would use to leave the island.
And what exactly did they talk about?
They discussed several things. For example, the decision to make a makeshift raft and life vest to cross the sea. They probably also talked about the tools that would be useful for carrying out the operation, like the dummy heads to deceive the guards once they were out of their cells. The final destination of their journey after reaching the mainland was likely discussed too. It's worth noting that in the meantime, Alan West changed his cell to be next to Frank's.
Wow, that's a lot of things to do. I'm curious how they got all that equipment.
Well, let's just say Frank Morris's new position helped a lot. He was assigned to the brush factory at the beginning of January 1962, located on the ground floor of the new Industries building. This new position likely allowed him to hide certain tools and objects useful for building the raft and life vests. Before that, Clarence Anglin also changed his job, working as a barber for the inmates. This role was crucial for collecting hair to make the dummy heads. John also switched positions and went to work in the clothing section, alongside a certain Mickey Cohen.
Mickey Cohen? The Los Angeles mob boss convicted of tax fraud? I had almost forgotten about his time at Alcatraz.
Well, it turns out that Cohen also played a role in the planning of this escape.
How's that?
It's said that, thanks to his influence, he used his outside contacts to assist the future escapees. This is a plausible theory, considering Cohen was the only convict in Alcatraz's history to be granted bail during his stay. He was released in October 1961, only to return in May 1962, 7 months later. And then there are Mickey Cohen's words, which he said after the escape. "There was a lot of talk, a lot of bullshit talk. You don't know how to separate the wheat from the shaft, like the saying goes. But these two kids, these guys, were solid son of a bitches. I want to believe they made it." Other rumors also circulated, suggesting that Cohen negotiated on behalf of the conspirators with another famous Alcatraz inmate, none other than Bumpy Johnson.
After the Godfather of Los Angeles, now we've got the Godfather of Harlem. Quite a crowd involved in this case.
Mickey Cohen and Bumpy Johnson were indeed seen walking together several times in the prison yard, which raised suspicion and piqued the interest of the guards. Bumpy was, in a sense, the leader of the African-American inmates at Alcatraz, a respected figure in organized crime. His status on the rock was significant, as indicated in this report. "He seems to have been a leader of the colored population. He's used his influence on 1 or 2 occasions in keeping down the trouble. He was reported as being a stabilizing influence during a period of racial tension. A stable individual who's highly respected and looked upon as an advisor by our colored population. He's on good terms with all inmates and is courteous and respectful to personnel at all times." His relationship with the prison staff even went further, as it's said that Bumpy, through a corrupt officer, used his outside contacts to help the escape group by providing them with a boat to flee. Thanks to his connections, Bumpy's also said to have arranged for a sum of money to be provided to the escapees. And it doesn't stop there, as it's also claimed that Bumpy bought the silence of African-American inmates imprisoned in cells behind the escape group. An ex-guard recalls.
"It remains a mystery to me that they didn't say anything. The cells butted back to back with the corridor in between. The black inmates were opposite the whites. They knew what was going on. When those inmates were crawling up there, night after night, bringing supplies up there, the black inmates could hear it. They never said a word." I don't get it. They had a lot to gain by informing the prison authorities about the escape plan. Why didn't they do it?
Looks like they obeyed Bumpy. By the way, going back to the Godfather of Harlem, it turns out he worked with Frank in the brush factory. He also worked with Clarence Anglin in the barber shop. In both cases, this gave him the chance to talk with them.
I see. Speaking of Clarence, there's another person we've forgotten. Carnes. He must have participated in the escape, right?
That was the plan, yes. But Carnes was apparently being watched, which forced him to back out for the good of the group. He still helped them, though, and his assistance was crucial for the future escapees. In order to escape, they needed to dig a hole in their cells. For this, they had a few contraband tools, such as metal saw blades and sharpened spoons. The idea was to dig around the ventilation grill of the cell to create enough space to access the unguarded service corridor just behind it. Once that was done, they could access the roof via a ventilation shaft. The cement walls of the cells had deteriorated over time, which they exploited as a weak point. For months, they secretly dug. When one would dig, the other would keep watch, and so on. To cover up their work, they used simple painted cardboard to fool the guards, who, of course, never suspected anything. Frank Morris even used his accordion to cover the sounds of their digging.
Pretty clever plan. And what did they do with the debris?
They put it in their pants pockets and then scattered it little by little in the prison yard. After that, they focused on creating the fake heads that would serve as decoys the night of the escape. The hair collected by Clarence, along with a mixture of toilet paper, soap, and concrete, were used to craft them after long hours of work. The makeshift raft was then constructed using stolen inmate raincoats, followed by life jackets and wooden paddles. They even managed to steal a vacuum motor to turn it into a drill to loosen the screws of the ventilation hole on the roof. They also made a periscope with a flashlight.
Wait, hold on. Where did they hide all this stuff?
Behind the wall of their cell and under the roof. That way, it was out of sight. Another notable thing, Frank Morris ordered 2 books, which might reveal the final destination of the escapees. 2 books to learn Spanish. Keep in mind that after a bank robbery in 1955, Frank had told the authorities he planned to escape to Mexico or South America to start fresh.
An interesting lead.
These guys left nothing to chance. In another testimony, Whitey Bulger tells us,
They were disciplined. They exercised. They were young, strong, and in excellent physical shape. By degrees, they dealt with the issues of acclimating to the shock of cold water. They trained hard, knowing full well the challenges they faced ahead. They exercised to build strength in their cells by running in place without socks on the cold cement floor. They draped cold, wet towels across their neck and shoulders, and inside their clothing to adapt while doing strenuous activity in cold conditions. These guys were resourceful and wanted every advantage.
And according to another inmate, they had a plan A, a plan B, a plan C, and even a plan D for every possible scenario.
Now that's what I call preparation.
They just had to choose the right date. On the night of June 11th, 1962, that's when they decided to put their plan into action. The night of the Great Escape. Whitey Bulger remembers it very well.
The night of the escape was exciting, but it was also unusually quiet at times. Many of us knew what was in the works. It was quiet, and then we heard a loud thud on the roof. All of us acted out by guys hollering and creating a deafening noise that had to rattle the guards and fortunately proved to distract them. Well, after we made lots of noise to help divert attention, the sounds just fizzled out and the cell house came to a normal quiet. Then a long night of visualizing what it was like for the guys and sweating it out. I was so excited I couldn't sleep the entire night. Every minute undetected meant one more minute ahead of the authorities.
The group of fugitives sets their plan in motion after the lights go out at 9:30 p.m. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, after placing their fake heads as decoys, exit their cells through the hole they had dug. Now in the service corridor where the ducts are located, they wait for Alan West, who, on his side, seems to have trouble getting out of his cell. The hole he had dug wasn't wide enough to get through. Alan West remains stuck in his cell. He won't be leaving with the rest of the group. No matter, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers continue without him. The trio then takes the service corridor with their equipment. They climb along a pipe, then access the roof through a ventilation shaft. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers cross the roof for about 30 meters. Thanks to a ventilation pipe, they're then able to descend to the ground. They climb 2 barbed wire fences and finally reach the north shore of the island. It's at this point that they deploy their makeshift raft, set sail, and disappear.
But where could they have gone?
If we're to believe Alan West's testimony, we had talked about going to Angel Island. It was believed that there would be less chance of detection if we proceeded in that direction. Upon getting to the mainland, we had decided that we'd commit a burglary so we could obtain guns and clothes, and then steal a car. It was our desire to go as far from this area as we could, although we had no plan as to where we would go. If we were successful in escaping, Morris and I had planned that sooner or later we would go in one direction and let the Anglin brothers go in another. It's not until the next morning that the alarm is raised. Whitey Bulger still remembers it.
The night seemed to linger on forever. It felt like a year until sunrise and count time. This was the big moment, and my heart was racing with excitement. A guard then got to Morris's cell because he wasn't standing up for the count and yelled, "Morris, get up!" The guard then reached into his cell and forcefully jabbed his head. Imagine his shock when it rolled off the bed and onto the floor. I think I could speak for everyone in the cell house that morning. It was a moment of freedom for all of us.
From then on, a massive manhunt was set in motion to find the escapees. But Frank and the Anglin brothers remain untraceable. One of the biggest manhunts in U.S. history was thus launched. Several theories will then emerge. Some thinking they drowned, while others believe the escape was successful. What's certain is that the FBI files show no firm conclusion, with theories based on limited evidence that prevent the case from being solved. A case that would become more and more complex, eluding investigators for decades.
What happened after they entered the water? There must have been something that could point us in the right direction. Alan West said they were supposed to head to Angel Island. Do you think that's where they went?
It's possible. But the testimony from Woodrow Gainey, another inmate who claims to have participated in the preparation of the escape with June Stevens, suggests otherwise. During their conversations, John Anglin had indicated that it was a shorter route to go from the island to the mainland of San Francisco rather than toward Angel Island. Later, the Anglins mentioned that they might try to steal a helicopter as Morris had read considerably in the prison library about flying, and Morris thought he would be able to pilot the aircraft. If they obtained a helicopter, they would fly a considerable distance from here, and thought somewhere in the California desert, they would stay for a number of months until the heat was off. They talked about later on getting together and robbing banks. None of the individuals mentioned anyone that they could contact on the outside. The most popular theory is that the trio drowned while trying to reach the mainland. However, no bodies were ever found. Only a wooden paddle and some personal belongings were recovered. But it's possible they left them behind to make the investigators believe they drowned. On the other hand, there's information that leads us to think that the Anglin brothers and Frank Morris actually survived. The FBI followed more than 100 leads across the country. There were many alleged sightings, with agents following clues that ranged from reports of sightings in hotels, bars, and banks, to more random reports of 3 suspicious-looking men in various cars. Additionally, the warden of Alcatraz reportedly received a postcard with the message, "Haha, we made it," signed by Frank, John, and Clarence. However, the FBI could not match the handwriting to any of the escapees. Clarence Carnes also claimed to have received the postcard more than 10 years later. The postcard contained the code words, "Gone fishing," which could mean they had succeeded. Another surprising fact, a phone call received by a renowned lawyer in San Francisco, who claimed to have received a call from John Anglin at her office.
"I'm John Anglin, and I want you to contact the U.S. Marshal's office to set up a meeting. Don't ask questions, just do as I tell you. Call the U.S. Marshal's office to set up a meeting. Do you know who I am? Read the newspaper."
The FBI installed a wiretap in her office, but he never called back.
Real ghosts.
All this seems very strange to me.
Just like the last words of Robert Anglin, the eldest of the brothers, who in his last breath quietly confessed on his deathbed,
"I've been with the boys. I know they've made it."
Earlier in his life, Robert had left Florida to settle in Texas without any logical explanation. His last words were therefore very surprising. Additionally, some of the Anglin siblings claimed that their mother received red roses every year for her birthday, always accompanied by 2 unsigned cards, even until her death in 1973. There were also Christmas cards signed by the brothers, without postmarks or any indication of origin, or the phone calls where only breathing could be heard on the other end. The best for last, this almost irrefutable piece of evidence suggesting that the Anglin brothers managed to reach South America and lived on a rural farm in Brazil. This information came from Fred Brizzi, a childhood friend of the Anglin brothers and a former trafficker working for South American cartels. He claimed to have contacted John and Clarence in the 1970s during a smuggling operation in South America. He then showed a photo from 1975 in which 2 men are seen in the Brazilian countryside. These 2 men would possibly be the Anglin brothers.
What? Was it really them?
Well, to find out, we had to wait 25 years until the photo was analyzed by facial recognition experts, and the result was as follows. According to all probabilities, the photo was authentic, which means it's very likely that the 2 people in the photo provided by Fred Brizzi are John and Clarence Anglin.
Incredible! And what about Frank? Was he with them?
Unfortunately, the fate of Frank Morris wasn't mentioned. Brizzi said there was another man with the 2 brothers, but his identity was never revealed. However, in 1967, a man called the authorities and claimed to have been Frank Morris's classmate. Knowing him for 30 years, he said he ran into him in Maryland and described him as having a small beard and a mustache. Unfortunately, he refused to give further details. Another statement came from Bud Morris, a man who claimed to be Frank's cousin, and he said he met him in person in a park in San Diego shortly after the escape. And that's about all we have on Frank Morris.
I see. That's a lot of information after all. I think we now have enough to carry out the investigation.
Yeah, and there's a lot of work to do. Let's get started without further delay. Wait, I see there's one last testimony from Whitey Bulger. I think he's sharing his conclusions about this whole affair.
The hope of the warden was they drowned. Convicts, they made it. I think they could have made it fairly easily. They likely stole a car and had many miles behind them before making a move to get money. They were smart and they had different phases and several contingencies in their plan. They put a lot of distance between them and Alcatraz in quick time. They also knew how to avoid suspicion. I believe they all made it to freedom and followed through with their plan to cut all ties. My opinion's that it was a case of strict discipline on their part to completely cut ties with everyone in their past. This is why no one ever heard from them. Not merely to just disappear, but to also protect their families. Prior to the escape, we discussed in detail the tactics that the feds would employ in trying to capture fugitives. One of their tactics was to use extreme pressure on the families. I know this firsthand. I know it's possible to effectively disappear. I know this firsthand. The trio didn't pull off the greatest escape ever in US history and not have a solid plan on how to survive once they were free. I know that as fact. As much thought goes into that as it does the escape. It's a painful dilemma. But for everyone's sake, they had no choice. It was easier for Mortis since he didn't have any close family. But it had to be this way for the security of everyone. This is how the trio survived. This is what we discussed and debated prior to the escape. Whenever I think back to my years on Alcatraz and that morning of June 12, 1962, it always raises my spirits, and I give a silent cheer to Frankie, John, and Clarence. God bless the trio. They helped shut down Alcatraz and made history. I hope they lived a long and happy life after Alcatraz.
And that's it. This is the end of the documentary film. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please feel free to like, comment, and share the video. It's the best way to reward my work. I hope this narration didn't disturb you too much. I wanted to go for a more cinematic style while still keeping the story true and authentic. I won't be using this style of narration for all the videos, but for this one, I wanted to try something different and take a bit of a risk. I can't wait to present the next video. We'll meet again as soon as possible. See you soon.